The sky over southern Lebanon was already burning, not from a single strike, but from a pattern. Distant flashes, then another, then another, each one closer than the last. On the ground, no one waited for confirmation anymore. They didn't need headlines. They could hear it. The sound came first, low, rolling, almost like thunder. Then the air shifted, then the impact. And somewhere, just across the border, a decision had already been made. Not a warning, not a threat, an expansion. On Sunday, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood in the north and declared that the operation would widen. The security strip, he called it, would grow. No map, no timeline, no limit, only one clear intention: to fundamentally change the situation in the north. But what does that actually mean when the fighting has already begun? Because Hezbollah still has rockets, still has reach, and still has the ability to strike. And now, the line, the one that once separated, contained conflict from something far larger, is starting to move. They call it a security strip. It sounds controlled, measured, almost clinical, a narrow zone, a buffer, something designed to keep danger at a distance. But in this part of the world, those lines have never stayed still. For decades, southern Lebanon has been shaped by that exact idea, a space between two forces meant to absorb the shock before it reaches deeper ground. Israel has used buffer zones here before, not as permanent borders, but as shifting front lines, places where control is asserted, lost, and asserted again. The logic is simple: push the threat farther away, create distance between rockets and cities. Because Hezbollah is not just a presence across the border, it is embedded, mobile, adaptive. Even now, Israeli leadership insists that Hezbollah still retains the ability to fire, not just occasionally, but effectively, which means that in their view, the current line isn't far enough. So the security strip expands. But expansion doesn't happen in empty space. It moves through villages, through roads, through places where people are still living, still waiting, still unsure if they should leave or stay. And every kilometer added changes something, not just on the map, but in perception. Because when a buffer zone grows, it raises a question no one can clearly answer. Where does it stop? Is it a temporary measure or the beginning of something that won't be pulled back? And if the goal is to push the threat away, what happens when the threat simply moves with it? By the time the announcement was made, the war had already moved beyond a single border. In Lebanon, the numbers were rising quietly at first, then, all at once, more than 1,000 people killed, entire neighborhoods reshaped by airstrikes, not one decisive battle, but a steady, grinding pressure, the kind that doesn't end in a day, or a week, or even a clear objective. For those living beneath it, the rhythm becomes familiar, too familiar. A distant aircraft, a moment of silence, then impact, and then waiting. Waiting to see what was hit, who was still there, what remained. One man, 71 years old, described it simply: "We don't know at what moment our homes could be targeted. Not anger, not even outrage, just uncertainty. And that uncertainty is spreading just as fast as the conflict itself. Because this isn't happening in isolation. Hezbollah is not just a local force. It is backed, supplied, connected. And beyond Lebanon, the signals are becoming harder to ignore. Iran is watching closely, not from a distance, but from within the structure of the conflict itself. Support flows quietly. Coordination happens out of sight. And now, the language is changing. What was once implied is starting to be said out loud. Warnings, threats, promises of escalation, all layered on top of a war that is already active, already expanding, and already pulling in actors who were never meant to be directly involved. Because once multiple fronts begin to overlap, once different conflicts start feeding into each other, it stops being a contained war. It becomes something else, something harder to define, harder to control, and far more difficult to end. What began as strikes across a border is now stretching across an entire region. And the deeper it spreads, the less clear it becomes where the center of the conflict actually is, or whether there still is one at all. Until now, Iran had been present but not visible. Its influence moved quietly, through proxies, through supply lines, through shadows, but that silence is beginning to break. The message, this time, wasn't subtle. If American troops enter the ground war, they would be set on fire, not a diplomatic warning, not carefully worded language, a direct threat. It came from one of the highest levels of Iran's leadership, a signal meant to travel far beyond the region itself. Because behind the words, there is movement. Across the Middle East, American forces are already shifting. Thousands of Marines, trained specifically for amphibious landings, have arrived in the region. Ships reposition, air assets expand, command structures adjust. Officially, it is preparation, a precaution. But in conflicts like this, preparation has a way of becoming momentum, and momentum has a way of becoming commitment. Iran sees it differently. To them, this isn't defensive. It's the early stage of something much larger, a ground operation being planned while talks are still being discussed. That contradiction between diplomacy and deployment is where the tension begins to tighten. Because once troops are in position, once the infrastructure is in place, the distance between possibility and action becomes very small, and Iran is preparing for that moment, not through conventional symmetry, but through asymmetry. Missiles, drones, proxies across multiple borders, a network designed not to win quickly, but to stretch the conflict until it becomes unbearable. Because if American forces enter directly, this war changes shape completely. It is no longer Israel and Hezbollah, no longer even a regional conflict. It becomes a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. Two forces that have avoided full-scale war for decades, suddenly standing one decision away from crossing that line. And now, for the first time in this conflict, that line doesn't feel distant anymore. It feels close, uncomfortably close. Even as the threats sharpen, another narrative begins to form. Quieter, calmer, diplomacy. In Islamabad, officials speak of meetings, of dialogue, of an opening, however small, between the United States and Iran. Talks are expected, soon, but no one can say exactly what kind. Direct? Indirect? Back channel? Even that remains unclear. What is clear is the timing. Because while diplomats prepare statements, militaries are already preparing positions. On one side, envoys discuss de-escalation. On the other, forces are being deployed, reinforced, and readied. Two tracks moving in parallel, but not necessarily toward the same outcome. Pakistan calls it facilitation, a chance to bring both sides into the same conversation, a controlled space, a neutral ground. But history has seen this before, moments where negotiations exist, not to resolve conflict, but to manage its perception, to buy time, to delay decisions, to create the appearance of restraint, while everything underneath continues to accelerate. Because real diplomacy requires one thing above all: trust. And here, there is almost none. Each side assumes the other is preparing for something larger. Each statement is weighed, not for what it says, but for what it might be hiding. So the talks move forward, announced, acknowledged, anticipated, but fragile. Because at any moment, one strike, one miscalculation, one escalation can render the entire process irrelevant. And that is the contradiction at the center of it all. A war expanding in real time, while negotiations attempt to slow something that may already be moving too fast. The question isn't whether talks will happen. It's whether they will matter by the time they do. What's happening on the ground is no longer confined to the ground, because the moment this conflict widened, it began to press against something far more fragile, the global system that depends on stability. And that system runs on movement, oil, gas, cargo, all of it flowing through narrow corridors that can be disrupted far more easily than they can be protected. At the center of it all lies one of the most critical choke points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow passage, just miles, across in places, but through it passes a significant portion of the world's energy supply. And Iran sits directly on it, not just nearby, but in control of its northern edge, which means that any escalation involving Iran immediately places that corridor at risk. Not through a full closure. It doesn't need to be. Even the threat of disruption is enough. Markets react, prices rise, insurance costs surge, because uncertainty is more powerful than action, and it doesn't stop there. Further south, another corridor begins to tremble. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a gateway between the Red Sea and the open ocean, essential for global shipping. Now, with Iranian-backed groups entering the conflict, that route too becomes vulnerable. Missiles don't have to hit every ship. Only one, only a few. Just enough to force rerouting, delays, rising costs, a ripple effect that travels far beyond the region itself. Because this is how modern conflict expands, not just through territory, but through systems. Supply chains stretch, energy markets tighten, air travel shifts, costs climb in places thousands of miles away from the first strike. And slowly, almost invisibly, a regional war begins to reshape global stability, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of pressures building at once, until the question is no longer just about who controls the ground, but whether the systems that connect the world can withstand the strain. Because once those systems begin to fracture, the impact doesn't stay local. It spreads, quietly at first, then all at once. Away from the maps, away from the statements and strategies, the war feels different, closer, quieter, and far more unpredictable. There are no briefings here, no clear objectives, only moments, a sound in the distance, a pause, then the realization that it might be closer this time. In parts of Lebanon, in nearby regions, even across borders, people are no longer asking if something will happen, only when. A man in his 70s described it without hesitation. We don't know at what moment our homes could be targeted. No strategy in that sentence, no politics, just the reality of living inside uncertainty. Because this kind of conflict doesn't move in straight lines. It lingers, it circles, it returns when least expected. Families adjust in small ways, windows left slightly open, not for air but to reduce the force of a blast, phones kept close at all times, not for conversation, but for warning. Sleep becomes lighter, shorter, never fully settled, and over time something shifts. Fear stops being a reaction and becomes a condition. Not panic, but constant awareness. The kind that follows you into every room, every decision. Do you stay? Do you leave? And if you leave, where do you go? When the conflict itself keeps expanding, because movement doesn't guarantee safety anymore. The front lines aren't fixed. They appear, disappear, and reappear somewhere else. And for civilians, that creates a different kind of pressure, not just physical danger, but psychological weight, the feeling that nowhere is entirely secure, that even distance is temporary. And while leaders speak of strategy and borders and outcomes, this is what the war looks like at ground level. Not maps, not objectives, just people waiting for the next moment they cannot predict, and hoping it doesn't arrive too close. While the front lines shift, another signal emerges, quieter but far more telling. Preparation, not for days, not for weeks, but for something longer. Inside Israel, the focus is no longer just on immediate operations, it's on sustainability, on endurance. Because war, once it stretches across multiple fronts, stops being about a single objective and becomes about how long a country can carry the weight. And that weight is already growing. The new budget reflects it. A massive increase in defense spending, more than $10 billion added, bringing the total to over $45 billion, more than double what it was just a few years ago. This isn't a short-term adjustment, it's a structural shift. Resources redirected, priorities reshaped, because sustaining a war on multiple fronts requires more than weapons. It requires funding that doesn't collapse under pressure. But that kind of increase comes at a cost, not on the battlefield, but everywhere else. Across government ministries, budgets are being cut. 3% across the board, services reduced, spending tightened, a quiet redistribution of national focus from civilian life to military necessity. And yet, even within that shift, there are fractures, because not all funding is being reduced equally. Certain sectors, politically essential ones, are receiving increases, hundreds of millions directed toward specific groups, private institutions, communities tied closely to the current government's support base. At the same time, funding for settlements continues, unchanged, even as broader cuts take effect. Critics call it misallocation, a diversion of resources during a time of crisis. Supporters see it as stability, maintaining internal alliances while facing external threats. But either way, it reveals something deeper. This is not just a military effort, it's a national balancing act between war and society, between external pressure and internal cohesion. Because prolonged conflict doesn't just test armies, it tests systems, economies, politics, public tolerance, and those pressures don't arrive all at once. They build gradually, until the question is no longer just whether the war can be won, but whether it can be sustained. Because preparing for a long war is not a declaration, it's a recognition that the path ahead is unlikely to be short. And once a nation begins to structure itself around that expectation, it becomes much harder to turn back. At first, it looked like separate conflicts, one in Gaza, another along the Lebanese border, tensions with Iran, always present but contained, each with its own logic, its own timeline. But now, those lines are starting to blur, because what was once divided is beginning to connect. In the south, fighting continues. In the north, the front expands. And in between, networks begin to activate. Hezbollah engages from Lebanon. Groups aligned with Iran shift their posture. Missiles, drones, cyber activity, all moving within the same widening frame. Not coordinated in a single command, but aligned in direction. Pressure from multiple sides, at multiple speeds, and that changes everything. Because a single-front war can be managed, resources are focused, decisions are contained, but a multi-front war stretches those limits. For Israel, it means dividing attention, air power redirected, ground forces repositioned, constant calculation. Where is the real threat? Which front matters most? And what happens if they all escalate at once? Because the danger is no longer just intensity, it's simultaneity. Strikes in one region triggering responses in another. Escalation, feeding escalation, until the conflict stops behaving like a sequence and starts behaving like a system. More than 3,000 people have already been killed across the broader war. And yet, there is still no single battlefield that defines it, no clear center, only overlapping zones of conflict, each influencing the other. And beyond the physical domain, another layer is forming. The digital front, cyber operations, information warfare, narratives competing just as aggressively as missiles, because modern war doesn't stay in one dimension. It expands across land, across borders, across systems, until what began as a localized confrontation becomes something far more complex. A network of conflicts, each one capable of escalating the others, and once that network is fully active, there is no simple way to shut it down. At every stage of this conflict, there has been a line, a boundary that once crossed would change everything. So far, each side has approached it, tested it, but stopped just short. Now, that distance is shrinking. Because the next phase of this war doesn't depend on what has happened. It depends on what might happen next. What if American forces move beyond positioning and enter the conflict directly? Not as support, not as deterrence, but as participants. What follows is no longer contained. Iran responds, not through words, but through action. Missiles, proxies, multiple fronts igniting at once, and suddenly, what was regional becomes global. Or consider another path. What if Iran escalates first? Not a warning, not a signal, but a decisive move, targeting infrastructure, shipping, or allied forces. The response would be immediate and irreversible. Because once direct confrontation begins between major powers, there is no controlled version of that outcome, only degrees of escalation. And then, there is the quiet scenario, the one that builds slowly. Shipping routes disrupted, energy markets destabilized, pressure accumulating across systems, no single moment that defines the shift, but a gradual slide into something far more unstable. A world not at full war, but no longer at peace. Each of these paths begins the same way, with one decision, one action that crosses the line everyone has been watching, but no one fully controls. And that is the uncertainty at the center of it all, not what has already happened, but what happens next. Because once that next step is taken, there may be no step back, only forward, into consequences that no one can fully predict. For now, nothing has fully broken. The borders are still there, the fronts are still defined, at least on paper. And yet, everything feels closer than it should, closer to escalation, closer to miscalculation, closer to a moment that cannot be undone. Across the region, there is no clear resolution, no decisive end in sight, only movement, forces repositioning, alliances tightening, warnings becoming more direct, and beneath it all, a kind of silence, not the absence of conflict, but the pause between decisions, the moment where everything hangs in balance, because every side understands what comes next, not in detail, but in consequence, that the next step won't just affect one border or one country. It will ripple outward, through regions, through systems, through lives far beyond the original line of fire. And so, for now, they wait. Leaders, soldiers, civilians, all watching the same horizon from different sides, knowing that something is building, even if no one can say exactly when it will arrive. Because in conflicts like this, the most dangerous moment is not always the strike itself. It's the moment before it, when everything is still but no longer stable, and the only certainty left is that the story isn't over, not even close. If you found this story worth understanding, share your perspective below.